Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I am so grateful to be sharing and learning with each and every one of you. And thank you for staying so late on such a fun night. I want to actually begin with an exercise. It is something that changes over time. It is something we largely take for granted. We don't really think about it being there until it's gone, and then we notice its importance. It can give us great pleasure in our lives, and we can be very thankful for its positive impacts. What is it? So, I'm not sure if I heard it, but no, not money. Some of you may have been thinking family. And you know, I would have answered the same some years ago. But the answer is actually support, social support. This evening, I want to share with you that social support is a key ingredient to living a good life, especially if experiencing low income. I learned this through years of talking with everyday, ordinary people, white, Black, Indigenous people, and people of color. Through the stories of women and men and 2S LGBTQIA+ people, I learned the importance of social support. Now, for some of us, family is everything to us. It's where we have all our needs met. But for others of us, family is actually a source of struggle, potentially harm, and difficult times. So what I want to convince you of this evening is that if family isn't everything, then social support just might be. So, what is social support? Well, right now, nothing. Social support is the help and protection that we give and receive with others in an ongoing social relationship. It is the emotional guidance, affection and care, the shoulder to lean on, a loving hand. We can call this expressive support. It is the financial, material, and physical aid that we give and receive with others. Things like the caregiving of young children and older dependents, shoveling the walk for our grandmother, or getting a short-term loan from family. This is instrumental support. Most of us experience these kinds of support from informal sources, from our family and friends. And in fact, if you really had to think about it, most of you here tonight, I dare say, is because of the expressive and instrumental support you received from others. What a lot of us don't think about, however, is that there are also other formal sources of support. And here I'm referring to government policies and programs and institutional systems. And in fact, I'm thinking here of BC income assistance, or the help that you receive from a caseworker if you're working with a nonprofit organization. Now, I didn't come up with these definitions on my own. It was actually during my PhD program when I was reading the work of sociologists, gerontologists, and social workers that I learned about social support. And I became inspired to try to understand, how does it work? How does it make a difference in people's lives? And so in much of my research, I'm also incredibly concerned with what social support means for people living in low income, specifically people in receipt of welfare benefits. So this evening, what I want to share with you is some highlights, I admit, of different research projects of mine over the years and with others to convince you of the importance of social support. So early on in my PhD dissertation research, I interviewed mothers and fathers who were accessing social assistance or welfare in the provinces of BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And what I learned from talking about parents in receipt of welfare in those provinces is that the only way that they could get by and survive was by sharing food and caregiving with others. Now keep in mind, in most provinces across Canada, and certainly in these ones, total welfare benefits provide incomes that are actually below the poverty line. So people are really struggling when they are in receipt of welfare. I also learned the importance of nonprofit organizations, of how often people turn to nonprofit organizations for help. Now, in terms of the first point there, what I was learning was not incredibly new. In fact, in a lot of the literature where people are focusing on the experiences of low-income families, it is very common for families to develop sources of support beyond that which they receive from the government. But what was new was the emphasis I was placing on kind of these layers of support in people's lives. And so I pushed this further in my work as it continued. More recently, I undertook a project where I interviewed people living with addiction and also in receipt of welfare benefits. And what I discovered is that welfare caseworkers are actually an invaluable source of expressive and instrumental support for people living with addiction. And this was particularly for people receiving Ontario Works, where I most recently worked, I admit, which is in the province of Ontario at a different university before I got here. That was a bit of an aside, but bear with me. Okay, what I learned is indeed through interviewing people living with addiction, welfare caseworkers can be an important source of support. Let me provide you an example from Bianca. When I met Bianca, she was 43 years old, a single woman. She had 4 children who were in the care of others. Bianca was working hard in recovery from an opioid addiction. She gives an example of how Scott, her caseworker, was a key person in her life for helping her pursue a different path. In other projects, I focused on how families will work together in order to manage poverty. And what I mean by that is how different members of a family and how different generations of a family will all work together in order to manage a family member's or a family unit's experiences of low income. In this work, we focused on how family members manage poverty across generations by exchanging these kinds of support, instrumental and expressive, with people who feel like family. And you might think, yeah, okay, what are you talking about? What I really want to stress here is that in this project, we had a very open-ended approach to family. We didn't define family as simply our conventional definitions of those we consider as family by blood, marriage, or adoption. We left it open to our research participants to tell us who were their informal sources of support. And what we found is many people named friends and close mentors, therapists, doctors, counselors, as feeling like family, and actually as kind of these integral sources of informal support. Let me illustrate this more clearly with an exercise that's called eco-mapping in social work. I'm not a social worker, but I really like this tool. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to this family, Sheila and Layla. Sheila and Layla were not related to each other by blood, marriage, or adoption, but they considered each other as family. Sheila and Layla had different social support networks, and I'll show you how they work now. This is Sheila. Sheila indicates that she has several sources of informal support that she draws on in her life. These are I guess for you, they're kind of gray-blue circles. So we have the conventional ideas of family, a mother, a sister, a daughter. But note how Sheila names Layla as being an informal source of support. Sheila also points to formal sources, these being Ontario Works, child tax benefits, and healthcare. Those are the purplish boxes. And then Sheila then points to community as another source of formal support, a transition program. In fact, one of the reasons Sheila and Layla defined each other as family is they had shared similar life course experiences. They had both immigrated to Canada. Then upon settling into Canada, they had both experienced the trauma of escaping intimate partner violence with children in tow. They came to know each other as family because they were participating in this same transition program. So now turning to Layla. And I hope you notice some interesting things about Layla's social support network. It's smaller, right? And what we see is that the informal sources of support are also smaller, but we note here that Layla, again, names Sheila as an incredible source of informal support in her life. Sheila is family to Layla. What I also want to draw your attention to is how Layla makes up the shortfall in informal support by drawing on formal sources. A network of social support also matters to exiting homelessness and becoming housed. When I met Isaac, he was 32 years old. He was recovering from an opioid addiction. He was housed. And Isaac had stories of how his mom played such an important role in his life by offering him, at different times, instrumental and expressive support. And here's what Isaac had to say. For Isaac, too, I think the one thing I want to stress that's not up here is the support he received from his mom, Isabel, also included her making it possible for Isaac to parent his infant son. Let me explain. Isaac was residing with his partner, Melanie, in housing. They had a home. Isabel had custody, temporary custody, of their son. Isabel would bring their son to their house and have visitation and sleepovers. So, through Isaac's mom's provision of instrumental and expressive support, Isaac was seeing a way forward into parenting and through recovery. When I met Elijah, he was in his 40s. He had immigrated to Canada at age 6. He had experienced quite a tumultuous childhood, a difficult adolescence. He ended up on the streets. He ended up using drugs. When I turn to Elijah, what I want you to observe is how Elijah is actually pointing to his counselor in his drug treatment program as being sort of the person that he goes to help him stay in recovery and to help him move forward. And I want for you to just take note how Elijah actually refers to his counselor as like my big sister. So the point I'm trying to convince you of is that indeed, in life, sometimes family is everything to us. Even think of Isaac. Isaac named his mom as such an incredible source of expressive and instrumental support. But for other of us, sometimes family isn't everything. And the argument I'm trying to put forward this evening is that it is actually a network of social supports, including formal and informal, and exchanges of different kinds of support that are essential to living a good life for any one person, but especially for people living on low income. So you might ask yourself, why does this matter? What is the significance of this research? Especially because we sociologists like to unpack the taken for granted stuff in society, okay? Let me tell you. On the one hand, these networks of social support that people develop when they are living in circumstances of impoverishment, they are incredibly complex. They seem to demonstrate actually people's resiliency and their ability to move forward. But I want to draw your attention to sometimes what's kind of less talked about, which is these networks also illustrate that all of us can do a lot better in supporting each other, and that in fact, we have good reasons to ask our governments and our politicians and our policymakers to make some profound adjustments to our income support policies and programs so that they actually can provide for a more reasonable, healthy standard of living and offer more opportunistic trajectories for people's lives. I want to include on an entirely different note. What I want to say is that I have immense gratitude to the people who spent sometimes over 2 hours talking with me and sharing with me their stories, especially sharing them with me, a white, middle-aged woman who lived a very different life than the one they were living. I'm thankful for the time and energy that they took to tell me about the importance of social support in their lives. And you might think, well, didn't you thank them before when you were doing the research? And I will say, why, yes. In research projects, we often offer thanks to our participants with honorariums, with footnotes in publications, with follow-up thank you emails, but a research project ends and time moves on. And so I want to take this opportunity to actually throw my thanks out into the universe and to say, I could not have learned the importance of social support if not for the time and energy that people gave me to help me understand it. I could not have learned it from books. I could not have learned it through collecting statistics. And for this reason, I am ever grateful. Thank you.